Hi again. We're in the Jehovah's Witnesses and Prophetic Speculation, Edmond Gruss. In the last segment, we were discussing the support that Russell derived from a book written by apparently two who were associated with the Russell group in those days. John and Morton Edgar of England had published The Great Pyramid Passages and Chambers in 1910. And this was publicized in the Watchtower. And the use it was put to in those days was to support the chronology that Russell already taught. I'll reread the last paragraph we used last time. The Great Pyramid was said to support the 1874, 1878, 1881, and 1914 dates Russell had determined by the Bible. Concerning this last date, Russell and many of the dear friends, as he put it, were rejoicing over the 7 corroborative proofs set forth in Morton Edgar's book, which showed, quote, that the close of the year 1914 will mark the closing of the times of the Gentiles and the beginning of the Messianic reign. Then Gruss goes on, it is worthy of note that the statements and measurements in Thy Kingdom Come were altered. That is, in the later editions of Thy Kingdom Come, the third volume of the Studies in the Scriptures, originally called Millennial Dawn. So then he asks us, Gruss does, to compare the two editions below. And I'm going to read a paragraph that puts the numbers from the two editions next to each other and try to follow. Here's the quote. Then measuring down the entrance passage from that point to find the distance to the entrance of the pit, representing the great trouble and destruction with which this age is to close, when evil will be overthrown from power, we find it to be 3,416 inches, which is then changed in the later editions to 3,457 inches, symbolizing 3,416 years from the above date, BC 1542. That is changed to 3,457 years, another alteration of 41 inches equals years. This calculation shows AD 1874, which in later editions is changed to 1915, as marking the beginning of the period of trouble. So 1874 is to the beginning of the period of trouble, and that is changed in these editions that Gruss is comparing here to 1915. For 1,542 years BC plus 1874, or 1,915 years, equals 3,416, or 3,457. Again, the 41 years difference. Thus the pyramid witnessed that the close of 1874, which is changed to 1914, was the chronological beginning of the time of trouble. And the change is to that the close of 1914 will be the beginning of the time of trouble. So the moving of 40 or 41 years. Now I've corroborated this. I have two editions here. The 1910 edition of Thy Kingdom Come, and the 1927, which appears to be the last edition of Russell's book that was published by the Society. And, of course, the next year, Rutherford not only threw out Russell's books as sources for his doctrines, but scrapped the idea that Russell was the faithful and discreet slave. So Gruss goes on, although alterations were made later, the smaller figures were defended by Russell as accurate in 1904. He said, we have no reason to question the accuracy of the figures given in Dawn, that is Millennial Dawn, Volume 3, the early edition. Of course, Gruss puts in the bracket. Yes, the early edition had given the year 1874 as the beginning of the period of trouble. And Russell goes on to say, we cannot therefore see how any longer measure for the passage could be possible. End of quote. Yet the edition of 1907 had already been changed to the larger figures. The teachings concerning the Great Pyramid were discarded by J.F. Rutherford, Russell's successor, about 12 years after his death, that is 1928. Now, Martin Gardner, in a book called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, said this about Rutherford's changes, quote, writing in the November 15th and December 1, 1928 issues of the Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, Rutherford releases a double-barreled blast against it, that is, the pyramid theory, and advances many ingenious arguments that the so-called altar in Egypt, all this, by the way, based on Isaiah chapter 19, if you want to look it up, all these ingenious arguments about the so-called altar in Egypt were really inspired by Satan for the purpose of misleading the faithful. Did Jesus ever mention the pyramid? Of course not. To study it, the judge writes, is a waste of time and indicates lack of faith in the all-sufficiency of the Bible. Isn't it nice that J.F. Rutherford is championing the all-sufficiency of the Bible? Well, of course, we know what he was really doing is substituting his own authority as an interpreter of the Bible for Russell's. So that's the end of the Gardner quote. Gruss finishes his analysis this way: the acceptance of pyramidology by Russell, and for a time after his death by the Society, is of some significance. As a previous chapter pointed out, advertising for the Watchtower stated that since its inception in 1879, it has consistently proven itself dependable. That's an actual quote, has consistently proven itself dependable. That was in the original edition of the New World Translation, page 793. Gruss says a number of issues of this dependable magazine supported pyramidology, and some advertised and sold works on the subject. This is even more shocking when it is realized that the Great Pyramid of Egypt was involved in many medieval and Renaissance cults, especially in the Rosicrucian and other occult traditions. That's, again, a direct quote from Martin Gardner's book on Facts and Fallacies in the Name of Science. Gruss concludes, Rutherford's judgment placed the Watchtower magazine in the position of explaining, endorsing, and selling material on the pyramid, which was really inspired by Satan for the purpose of misleading the faithful. And of course, that's Rutherford's attitude when he repudiated the teaching of Russell on this subject of the Great Pyramid in 1928, inspired by Satan for the purpose of misleading the faithful. I'll put in a link to the 7 predictions Charles Taze Russell did make about 1914 in the original editions of his books. And our disappointment, Vivian and mine, when we found out that, yes, Russell indeed had changed the text of his books in those 2 crucial years between 1914 and his death in 1916. Russell had actually manipulated the text of his books without acknowledging that this was a revised edition. So 7 predictions Russell made about 1914. See you soon.